So for this module on Indigenous sexualities, I'm fortunate to have this opportunity to share a conversation with my colleague, Professor of Women's and Gender Studies, Dr. Lana Whiskeyjack. Professor Whiskeyjack is an artist and scholar from Saddle Lake Cree Nation, Treaty 6 Territory, Alberta. She has an art and design diploma from Red Deer College, a BA in art and culture and art history from Carleton University in Ottawa, an MA in Canadian Studies and Women's Studies, also from Carleton, and a PhD from Blue Quills University, which is a former Indian residential school that was attended by 2 generations of Professor Whiskeyjack's family members. Professor Whiskeyjack's research and art practice focus on Indigenous women's sexual, reproductive, physical, spiritual, and mental health and well-being, and on transforming intergenerational trauma into resiliency through arts-based practices and by reconnecting to the Cree language and worldviews. She is featured in the 2017 film Lana Gets Her Talk that explores many of these issues. We are having this conversation in May 2023, and Professor Whiskeyjack currently has a solo exhibition at the Art Gallery of Alberta from April through August, When the Night Shines Like the Day, which is an exploration of Cree teachings of the 13 sacred moons. So thank you, Lana, for agreeing to have this conversation with me today for Women's and Gender Studies 270. This is an introductory course in feminism and sexualities, and one module out of 12 is on Indigenous sexualities, but this is a topic that students can explore further in the department and at the university, and specifically they could take a course you offer, an upper level seminar on Indigenous genders and sexualities. So in a moment, I'm hoping that you can say a bit about what you teach in this course and how it relates to your own research and art practice. But first, can you start out by introducing yourself to the students? And is there anything you'd like to share about yourself and your work beyond the few things I've just said by way of introduction?
Yes, thank you. I'll introduce myself in my mother's language, my language, language of this land, Nehiawewen. And I'll share a bit about that and the importance, and actually why it actually grounds a lot of my work. So Tanse, Kakiao, Nawagamaganak, Lana Whiskeyjack, Nitsigoson, Onyx Kopono Tsekotsenia, Egua, Edoskeano Tapasnegao, Mina. First and foremost, Aisinu Ota, Otsi, Aski. First and foremost, a human of this land, but my belly button connections, as mentioned by Chloe, is to Saddle Lake Cree Nation, which is reserve just about an hour and a half northeast of Mesquitchie, Wisconsin, of here, Edmonton. But I often like to kind of preface myself as a reminder that I do come from this land. It's kind of like a land acknowledgement as being, I have a responsibility and an important kinship role to our Nagawi Ski, our Earth Mother. And so, and then I also have an important responsibility, as mentioned in my Cree language of Nitsigasun. My name is, I am from Saddle Lake Cree Nation, Otsinia. And the root word of both Nitsigasun and Otsinia, my name is and I am from, is Utsi or Nitsi, my belly button. And so how in that connection, I'm connecting myself to the land, but I'm also connecting myself to those matriarchs, my grandmothers, my great grandmothers, my ancestors, those women who I came from, and whose work, that their prayers, their work, their roles and responsibilities are carried through me. And therefore I have the responsibility to carry on their knowledge, their teachings, our worldviews, especially Indigenous worldviews and ways of knowing and being, through my live Earth experience to the next generation. I am a mother, I'm a grandmother, I'm a wife. I have many roles within my community, including being a helper to a lot of our matriarchs within ceremonies, and as well as with language revitalizations that help inform my work around gender and sexual diversity. So that's a little intro about me and that importance, especially coming from a Cree worldview, or what we call ourselves as Nehiao, which means a four-part being of this land. So I have, so that's kind of a little short introduction about who I am and through my language and the responsibilities I carry as a Nehiao Esquel.
Thank you so much. Can you explain what you mean by rematriation and why that might be a better term than feminism for your work on Indigenous genders and sexualities and Indigenous women's health and well-being?
Absolutely. Well, feminism when I was in my master's degree in Canadian studies, I took a lot of women's studies and my very first feminist course. I just did not connect to it. And in that program, my final project or paper for that course was actually why Indigenous women can be feminists. I mean, I just came out as an Indigenous feminist a couple of years, it's been 2 years this summer. And partially because I grew up with a very strong matriarch, my grandmother, actually her sister. This is a painting of one of my many grandmothers, of women who carried a lot of that matriarchal sacredness and teachings and power, or what my grandmother would call medicine as well, and my mother's mother. And so within those teachings is like that women had always had a very strong leadership and governance within our kinship and our political governance structures and the economy and all parts of our communities up until 2-3 generations ago. And when the Indian Act of 1876 infringed on our local and matriarchal kind of governance structures, removing that power and authority from our mothers and especially our grandmothers. Prior to that, at that time too, we also had this ethic or law of non-interference. And so, but those, which is another huge concept don't have time to get into, but basically we never infringed or manipulated or enforced our own power beliefs onto another person. So colonization was a huge, of course, interference. But when we practice the ethic of non-interference, the ones that had the authority and power within our communities were our grandmothers. So they were the ones who corrected behaviors. And they did it through indirect or direct ways, whether it was through storytelling. And for my grandmother, I have stories of where she would correct behaviors through public humiliation, especially if there was gender or sexual violence involved. So, when I think about Indigenous feminism, it doesn't quite align with what I've been taught. Although I definitely have identified with it. It's, of course, that whole linear kind of historical relationship of feminism, that carries, coming from that first wave to the second wave to now being that inclusive of Indigenous feminism, whereas rematriation is really about returning back to our matriarchal teachings, that governance, the authority, and that power that our matriarchs had within our community. So it's not something new. It is something very old that we are, that it's not even that old if my grandmother was carrying and still practice those, even though she was under the authority of the Indian Act. But with her and her family and community, she definitely asserted her matriarchal power and governance. And and I would feel sorry for any of those who challenged her, because she had a great kind of respect and courage and strength, actually, not just a spiritual strength, but physical strength to enforce and correcting any behaviors that impacted her autonomy and authority. And she was the first generation to go to Indian residential schools. And so I even heard stories about how she would challenge the nuns and priests in those schools. But of course, that came with also a harsh and violent punishment. So when she left, and of course, as her granddaughter, she made sure to instill that nobody has that kind of right and power over my body, mind, and spirit. So to me, rematriation is really about reclaiming, restoring, rebalancing the power within our communities, our families, even within ourselves, our own body autonomy. So that's a little stories that go around rematriation and that difference from Indigenous feminism. And I can't even, like, I have an auntie who again, my grandmother's daughter, who is taking up that work within her community, and definitely has been impacted by Indian residential schools, as she was part of that last generation to attend. But she would never, even though some may call her an Indigenous feminist, she would never ever identify herself in that way, because she's like, no, matriation has always been on these lands. Feminism is a new kind of language and concept that doesn't reflect our Indigenous or Cree worldview on matriarchal power, authority, and governance.
Just as a quick follow-up, we often hear about repatriation of land. And would you speak of rematriation of land as well? Or how does rematriation relate to repatriation?
Yes. So again, like, we see our earth as our mother. We have kinship terms for all living beings, the wind, the elements, the seasons, and there's kinship terms for that. So for the land, our earth, she's our mother. And again, because she's our mother, we have a kinship role and responsibility, as with mothers and daughters, fathers and sons, grandparents and grandchildren, great grandparents and great grandchildren. Like, there's specific protocols and roles and responsibilities with those kinship roles, right? And so having rematriation of land is actually restoring our mother, or like our earth as our mother, that kinship, and treating her as such. Like, there's this painting behind me of, again, that reminder of our mother to provide, protect, and nurture little spirits, those children, and growing them to be healthy, independent, autonomous beings that grow to be of service to others, to help the community, to help those who are vulnerable, to help our elders, to provide and protect, and so forth. It's always about being in that web of connections through the kind, compassion, love, respect, truth, all of that. Of course, balancing within those other challenges that come, as what we see in our Western world as binaries, right? But within our Indigenous worldview, we see them as constantly being in complementary. They're complementary roles instead of being opposites. And again, that power relationship. So when it comes to the land, is again restoring that, also the authority and responsibility of those matriarchs as water protectors, right? As carriers of that water, just that as many women carry that sacred waters within their wombs, that again is a reminder of how we must carry and protect the sacred waters of the land, and helping with our mother. And so rematriation of the land is about, again, those matriarchs, and the matriarchs don't necessarily have to have wombs either, which we'll get to around genders and sexualities, but that they are in in a space where they can return back to being a better relative, a better human being of our mother, of our lands. And so rematriation is for everybody, for every human being. It's about centering that mother role and responsibility, that and belief in it. So men, women, or gender diverse folks, relatives, are respecting that matriarchal, again, those values.
Thank you. In introducing you, I mentioned your current AGA exhibition, When the Night Shines Like the Day, and that it's an exploration of Cree teachings of the 13 sacred moons. Can you say a bit about the 13 sacred moon teachings and how these are explored in your art and scholarship?
Yes. So all of my series of works are kind of like this, a continuation of previous work. So the work previous to that was around beauty. And then I started researching and working more with community around reclaiming our gender diversity. But again, through rematriation of grandmothers taking care and nurturing those spirits of those children, of those diverse beings, like raising them in that kind, loving, supportive way where we're strengthening their spirit and asserting who they are and their gifts that they bring to this land. So the 13 moons, I originally was planning to work with elders and different matriarchs and gender diverse knowledge keepers. And then COVID happened. So I ended up doing these series of really exploring the land, some medicines within each of those 13 moons. Because in our Cree calendar system, we followed, again, our grandmother moon, another important matriarch, kinship matriarch. We followed her cycles, the 28-day cycles, and then which was also brought the teachings around the 13 moons. So right now we've entered May, and our leaf budding moon, April was frog moon, and so throughout the year and a half I was creating those paintings, was looking at connecting to the land and connecting to those matriarchal kind of values of how can I walk or practice, bring these theories, right, these rematriation kind of ideas and concepts and theories into practice. Like this is again like how our ancestors lived and didn't even think about, and didn't have any other way of relating to the land that we do now in this day and age. So the moons that I've experienced are not the same as my great-grandmother or even my grandmother's generation. And so it was about connecting to those teachings, and each of those moons, and I do have like an animated video, an animation of my art available on Lana Whiskeyjack YouTube channel, but that gives a bit more details about each of those moons, and of course going to the AGA, but to see the paintings, which are pretty large, is looking at each painting has teachings on that includes tools, medicines, from plant medicines to animal medicines. So you'll often see an animal, you'll see a tool, and in an environment, of course, that reflects that moon. So for example, like the leaf budding moon, we live in Alberta that has such a different, changing climate or weathers, right? It could be snowing, or like what we're experiencing now with the many fires. And so there's just a lot of climate changes impacting actually our relationship to the land and even with our moons. So sometimes April would be the time we would go tap our our birch, but it's been more now into working into May of tapping those birch. And again, birch is a medicine. The birch water is a powerful medicine. And so those whole 13 moons is exploring that matriarchal kind of rematriation that includes, men with wombs, that includes are all gendered beings, are, as one of my elders call Ikwewak in our language, are all gendered beings. And so, but they're all represent that rematriation of coming back into their power of being a better relative to our Mother Earth.
Thank you. So my last question is about Indigenous genders and sexualities. And what do you teach and research in this area? And how has settler colonialism impacted genders and sexualities for Indigenous people? And what does it mean to you to decolonize these?
I mean, I spent a whole semester introducing this, right? And to put it very, very short, is that settler colonialism has removed our gender and sexual diverse relatives. They've, in a sense, criminalized them. They dehumanize their roles and responsibilities. And so for a few generations, we forgot about those teachings, like especially for those who went into Indian residential schools where children were separated into boys and girls, and there was no space for gender diverse relatives. And so there was a lot of homophobia, transphobia, and discrimination within our communities around our gender diverse relatives, and definitely sexual diverse relatives as well. And so again, through rematriation is going back to our grandmothers and, the matriarchal values of valuing every single spirit of those human beings and looking at their gifts and skills and knowledge that they come to, that we're nurturing them to use in a way that is going to benefit our families and communities, especially the South. So as autonomous, sovereign human beings. And so when we're looking at, so my research was looking at, especially being a mother of transgendered, well, he's a man now, but of course he'll always be my child, is as a parent was my responsibility of what can I do to contribute to making him courageous to be who he is, but also impacting my spaces within this world so that let's decrease gender and sexual violence. And especially as an Indigenous woman, where we have the highest rates of violence towards our Two-Spirit and Indigenous women's bodies. And so, again, a direct impact of settler colonialism on our Indigenous kinship relations. And so having my research focus around creating courageous spaces for our Two-Spirit youth and their families, looking at returning back to those rites of passage and holding them within that matriarchal space, which of course includes men. My husband's a very important part of supporting that space as a provider, as a protector, as as a father and grandfather. And same with any other young male identifying, they have very important roles of being able to return back to those rematriating spaces of nurturing, loving, and raising healthy human beings from that gender diverse place. And so from the teachings around Indigenous genders and sexually diverse relatives is that we kind of going back to in our Indigenous worldviews, we don't look at things in binaries. To me now, when I hear certain Indigenous speakers using that language of binaries of very male to female without being inclusive of gender diverse folks is, again, how colonialism has impacted our language and worldviews. So making sure that we always have being inclusive of, especially through our language and speaking and teaching about and researching on Indigenous diverse relations. And so in our specifically, because I'm Cree or Nehiyaw, in our Nehiyaw worldview, we have many genders, so mostly we keep from the teachings, there's 8 genders, but to me, it's very fluid and it will continue growing because of our concepts of gender is not the same as in English. And so again, it goes back to the roles and responsibilities of each autonomous human being. But there are energies, just like there are energies, and I mean physical, biological components of those energies as feminine and masculine. And so I'm a squirrel. I'm a female. My husband identifies as male, very masculine. And but in between, of course, we have our son who has a uterus. We have a daughter who has a uterus. We have a son who doesn't have a uterus. A different kind of gonads, but it's really what we again focus on within gender and sexual diversity is that we traditionally, from our Indigenous worldview, have always been very fluid. We can go in between of that masculine and feminine medicines, basically, because they both carry important medicines that contribute to family and community. So in Cree, we have a word for family. It's and when you break down that word, it starts with peyak, which means one, but ends with waomak, so many. So we are one of many. And Cree language, it is not a gendered language. It's not masculine and feminine. And the only pronouns in Cree is they, them. So again, it reflects that fluidity of that we can shift into many those diverse, like 8 genders that I mentioned, which I go through more thoroughly within my classrooms. But energy and the medicines of people, or medicine meaning like the skills and knowledge and energy of a person, is really important of what they bring into spaces, especially our social interactions and social relationships.
Thank you so much. That was the last of my questions. Are there any last things that you would like to share, or any last points?
Yeah, no, this is like our language around Indigenous genders and sexualities and even rematriation is still very new. There's not a whole lot written about it. So hopefully in the near future, there is a lot like on Indigenous feminism. You can find books on Two-Spirit, right? And how a lot of Two-Spirit academics, researchers, writers are sharing so much more teachings around their teachings from their cultural language perspectives, which is incredible. So yeah, but there is definitely not one Indigenous ways of understanding that. They're so diverse. And again, if we practice the ethic of non-interference and learn how to listen and make those connections of being better relatives, that is a way of practicing rematriation. It's a way of practicing Indigenous feminism and just being a better and even being a treaty relative is by learning to be connecting to the land and the teachings and the languages of this land.